At their core, item cards are the easiest to use cards as there's no restriction on how many of them you can use per turn, unlike stadiums and supporters, of which you can only play one per turn. As this video will include some cards from pre-Black and White, we will consider every of those unrestricted trainer cards as items except A-Specs, as those will be featured in a different video. In its 10th place is a card that's very unique in its use, but has actually been around ever since the base set, at least concept-wise. Lillie's PokéDoll from Cosmic Eclipse can be put into play just like a Pokemon card, but if it should be knocked out, your opponent doesn't take any prize cards. This can be very effective by some turns when your opponent isn't able to target any of your bench Pokemon to attack them, or even as an entire strategy by itself where you try to get back your Lillie's PokéDolls infinitely to prevent your opponent from closing out the game by taking 6 prizes. This card was most prominently paired with Florges from Forbidden Light with its Wondrous Gift ability. This ability allows you to flip a coin, and if heads, put an item card back on top of your deck. Since this ability wasn't limited to once per turn, you could simply set up multiple Florges to get up to 4 flips and increase your chances to get back your Lillie's PokéDoll for the next turn, and just put it active again after the previous one was knocked out. As previously mentioned, this was not the first time that a card like this was introduced to the Pokemon TCG. Clefairy Doll from base set was the first ever item card that worked like a Pokemon in play that didn't give up any prize cards. An interesting part about this card is that unlike Lillie's PokéDoll, it couldn't be affected by any special conditions, something that should rarely matter on a card with 10 HP, but still worth noting the difference. Another card that worked similarly to the previous two was Robo Substitute from Phantom Forces. It provided 20 more HP than Clefairy Doll, matching Lillie's PokéDoll at 30 HP, and also could be affected by special conditions just like it. The big difference is that Lillie's PokéDoll, apart from the other two cards, was that if you didn't have any use for it anymore, you could just put it back at the bottom of your deck instead of having to be discarded like the other two cards. This might not seem like a lot, but being able to conserve a card that's meant to frustrate your opponent was an immense advantage. Interestingly enough, there's also another category of item card Pokemon that used to work very similar to these cards. Up until Diamond and Pearl, any of the fossil cards that would be used to evolve into reanimated Pokemon from the video games also didn't count as knocked out Pokemon, meaning that they could be used similarly. In 2004, there was even a deck featuring Ninjask from Dragon and multiple copies of Claw Fossil, Root Fossil, and Mysterious Fossil. Ninjask's Quick Touch attack allowed it to deal 30 damage and switch itself with the bench Pokemon, meaning your opponent would have to go through up to 12 fossils before being able to take any prize cards. Maybe this was the reason why fossils eventually started to give up prizes, and we only rarely get to see these kinds of effects again. One of the core aspects to properly play the Pokemon TCG is being able to access your cards when you need them. Luxury Ball allowed you to search your deck for any Pokemon, but had one very special restriction that we haven't seen ever since. This card could only be played if you didn't already have a copy of Luxury Ball in your discard pile, meaning that it didn't exactly prevent you from playing more than one in your deck, but made sure you couldn't just use multiple copies in this same game. Energy cards are usually played in a high amount, but when it comes to Pokemon, it can sometimes be hard to find them when you need, as you're only ever allowed to play 4 cards of the same name. This is where search cards come in that allow you to pick up exactly the card from your deck that you need. This goes as far back as Pokeball from Jungle that allowed you to search your deck for any Pokemon, but required a coin flip to land in your favor. Most of the time, these search cards continue to be printed as different kinds of balls from the video game, but they all shared one trait. All of them had some kind of limitation printed on them, whether it was how they could be played, like Ultra Ball, that required you to discard 2 cards in order to be played, a limitation of what you could find, such as Level Ball, which only lets you choose a Pokemon with 90 or less HP, or both, like Quick Ball, which was only able to pick up basic Pokemon, but also required you to discard a card in order to be played. Even the best card among them had its limitation, but was still powerful enough to make it onto this list. When the card was printed, recovering resources was not something that was part of the game. But it didn't stop most decks from running at least a copy of Luxury Ball to pick up some Pokemon. Years later, Luxury Ball was replaced as the most generically usable item searcher when Master Ball got an A-Spec printed in Plasma Blast. It could pick up any Pokemon from your deck and had no restrictions, but we'll take a look at A-Specs in a future video, which is why they won't be featured on this list. And at number 8, we have Reset Stamp. This card shuffled away your opponent's hand and had them draw cards equal to the remaining prize cards. Something that has always been a powerful tool in the Pokemon TCG is Disruption. Its most basic form is being able to deal with your opponent's hand and making sure they won't be able to use it properly afterwards. Usually this comes in the form of supporter cards, but when Reset Stamp was introduced as an item card, it immediately became an automatic inclusion in a lot of decks. Being an item card meant that this card could be paired with many powerful supporters that could either disrupt your opponent even further, or give you access to new cards or other ways to abuse them. Arguably, the strongest combination of cards with Reset Stamp were Jesse and James from Hidden Fates that would force your opponent to discard 2 cards, meaning you can get them to 0 cards in hand if you use Reset Stamp on them when they only had 2 prize cards remaining. This could be taken even further paired with Wheezing from the same set, that upon being discarded by the effect of Jesse and James would discard an additional card from your opponent's hand with its Surrender Now ability, making the disruption combination possible 1 prize card earlier. Mars worked similarly, but only discarded 1 card from your opponent, but in return drew 2 cards for its user. Either or both of these supporter cards could even be paired with Lieutenant Search's strategy, which allowed you to use 2 additional supporters if behind on prize cards. This would technically allow you to get your opponent down to 0 cards in hand while in 5 prizes if you could manage to get the correct combination of cards. Another interesting way to use Resent Stamp was its interaction with Naganadel GX with its Stinger GX attack that would put both players on 3 prize cards, meaning you could use Reset Stamp when your opponent only had 1 prize card remaining and afterwards force them into having to take 2 additional ones. This combination was even used in the final game of the 2020 Oceania International Championships to clutch out a game that seemed lost. Even without any of these combinations, this card was incredibly powerful, but its ability to be paired with heavy disruption cards eventually led to its ban in the expanded format. And in 7th place, we have Computer Search, an item card that allows you to discard 2 cards from your hand to search your deck for any card and put it into your hand. It was actually among the first couple of released item cards all the way back in the base set. This is a card that would have seen play in whichever kind of era of the Pokémon TCG, because Universal Search is one of the best effects any card can have. I mean, who doesn't like grabbing exactly the card you need in the situation you need it in? We even saw a glimpse of this card's power when it was released as an A-Spec with the exact same effect, but now only being able to use once in a deck due to how A-Spec's rules that allowed you to only play one of them in your deck total. It still became an immense inclusion in almost every deck, and even nowadays, Computer Search is usually the A-Spec of choice in most expanded decks. It's hard to pinpoint a key strategy this card has been part of, as it was so universally usable, but the fact that it isn't in the upper half of this list should give you a good idea of how powerful the cards still to come are. And at number 6, we have Versus Seeker. This card allows you to pick up a supporter card from your discard pile and put it into your hand, making it possible to easily use more than 4 copies of a card. While most modern era players will agree that this card is incredibly powerful, it took some time and also some good supporters for people to appreciate it. Its first ever printing was in Fire Red and Leaf Green all the way back in 2004. Back then, most players were actually content with the amount of copies their supporters gave them, and often even chose not to run the full amount of 4 copies for those that they didn't seem very necessary. Only occasionally did some copies of Versus Seeker make it into decks, and especially when Holen Transceiver was released, people completely opted out of it. Holen Transceiver was the core aspect of the Holen engine, a large variety of Pokemon, trainer, energy cards that could interact with each other to gain access to powerful combos. Holen Transceiver started the combo by being able to fetch a Holen supporter card from your deck, but that wasn't everything. In addition to being able to grab supporters in the deck, it could also grab it from the discard instead, giving you a second use for a previously played supporter. Even with the Holen engine around, some players still realized how powerful Versus Seeker was and decided to run a copy in their decks, mostly to get secondary uses out of non-Holen supporter cards that were still played. A few years passed until Versus Seeker eventually got its first reprint in the 2009 set Supreme Victors. Some would say that this printing came at an unfortunate time for the play rate of Versus Seeker, because most supporters during the time were simply used for setting up your Pokemon in order to use their Pokepowers or bodies to supply you with further resources, or other ways to allow you to continue the game. Only rarely did players run out of the supporters and wish for additional uses for them. Some decks still found ways to include 1 or 2 copies for new situations that would require additional uses of one-off supporters, or simply to have more ways to redraw your consistency supporters after the first use, basically keeping an additional copy in the deck. Its third printing was finally when players realized how powerful a card like Versus Seeker was, and the time of its release also allowed for many uses. Another 5 years later in 2014, Phantom Forces brought back Versus Seeker. There were multiple reasons why it immediately had success upon its third release. The first and most important reason was the way that the game had changed in the years prior. Most decks had started to play the same 3 supporter cards as their core lineup. Professor's research allowed a player to discard their hand and draw 7 new cards, making it a powerful consistency card. In worked both as a draw and disruption supporter by shuffling both players' hands into the deck and drawing cards equal to their remaining prize cards. Lastly, Lysandra allowed both players to switch one of their opponent's bench Pokemon with their active one. Usually, all of them were played at 4 copies each, meaning that Versus Seeker could give you additional access to any of them, which became especially useful when considering opposing ends that could leave you with low hand sizes. Versus Seeker simply made it more likely to draw any of the good supporters. The second reason why Versus Seeker became so good was a card that was also printed in Phantom Forces. Battle Compressor is widely considered one of the best item cards ever printed, and only barely missed a spot on this list. It simply allowed you to discard up to 3 cards from your deck. This might not immediately seem useful, but decks that heavily worked with discard piles could make great use of it. It also allowed players to play a lot of one-off supporters to use with Versus Seeker. Battle Compressor could either directly be used to put them into your discard pile, as it was much easier to gain access to one of your 4 Versus Seekers in order to use any of those cards, or to get rid of the ones that you wouldn't need against a specific deck. This card's third use was deck building improvements. Even without Battle Compressor, Versus Seeker made it much easier to fit tech cards into your deck that would mainly be used in specific matchups, and therefore it didn't warrant more than 1 or 2 copies. This gave players a lot more deck building creativity and made it possible for some decks to completely flip multiple matchups around. While still being legal for play, Versus Seeker got a secret rare printed in Roaring Skies, meaning it would take even longer for it to rotate. During the entirety of its third life cycle, it was a staple inclusion in every deck. And I have no doubt that if we were to see a comeback anytime soon, we would see more decks run 4 copies of it again. And at number 5, we have Item Finder. This card allows you to discard 2 cards and pick up any trainer card from your discard pile. With half of our list being done, it's time to get into the area of cards that under no circumstance will ever come back in the form that they're listed here, because they're simply too broken. Just like Computer Search before, this card's release goes all the way back to the base set. Even back then, Item Finder was a core card in any deck and played the maximum capacity of 4 copies, showing that recovering trainer cards has always been an insanely strong concept in the Pokémon TCG. More than 10 years later in Heart Gold and Soul Silver Triumphant, this card got a worthy successor in Junk Arm. Junk Arm also had a cost to discard 2 cards and allowed you to take back 2 trainer cards. Now, you might think that this is the exact same text as Item Finder and should work the same. Under normal circumstances, this would be correct, but because of the rules and terms and wordings and attribution for trainer cards have changed, so did Junk Arm's use. With the introduction of supporter cards, any card that would strictly be applied to trainer cards would only work in what we know as items, which is one of the main reasons why it was completely overhauled in Black and White. Up until that change, the 3 classes were called supporters, stadiums, and trainers, until they were all grouped up as trainers with the subcategories supporters, stadiums, and items. With Junk Arm's use, this meant it could only grab item cards and not stadiums or supporters. This didn't stop it from being included in some decks in the beginning to recycle some of the better item cards. Just like Versus Seeker before, it took players some time to realize truly how powerful this kind of effect was, but nowhere near as long as it did for Versus Seeker. Shortly after the release of Black and White, most of the decks we see running 3 or 4 copies of Junk Arm as the meta became much more item heavy, proving just how strong Item Finder still was, even in a nerfed version. Towards the end of Black and White Block and Plasma Storm, this card also received an A-Spec reprint in Dowsing Machine, bringing back the original effect of recovering any kind of trainer card. Dowsing Machine has seen a lot of play since it was brought back, but it's very unlikely we'll ever see an item card like Item Finder as a regular printing ever again. And at number 4, we have Scoop Up, a card from the base set that's actually very similar to a card that's illegal for play nowadays. Just like the name suggests, Scoop Up allows you to scoop up one of your Pokemon in play and put it into your hand. One thing that's very interesting about its wording is that it specifies you get to pick up its basic stage, meaning you wouldn't only have to discard any cards attached to it like tools and energies, but should it be evolved, you would also have to get rid of the higher stages. This might not seem like a lot, especially when putting it up to Scoop Up Net, which was printed in 2019, and just picks up all previous stages as well, without being able to pick up a GX or V Pokemon. To put into perspective how good Scoop Up actually is, we need to put in historic and current context separately. When it was first released, most of the decks were heavily reliant on basic Pokemon as their main attackers, allowing for Scoop Up to be an option to fully heal Pokemon that was close to being knocked out. The best use for Scoop Up was being paired with Alakazam from the base set. Its damage swap Pokepower allows you to move damage counters on your side of the field to a Pokemon of your choice. This was used to move all the damage from your attacker to high HP Pokemon like Chansey until you could eventually pick it up with Scoop Up to mitigate multiple attacks from your opponent. While this historic use of Scoop Up already shows its potential, we need to move a little bit further ahead in time to fully showcase how powerful these kinds of effects are. Not too long after Scoop Up's release, the Pokemon TCG introduced its successor in Neo Genesis. Super Scoop Up made it possible to pick up a Pokemon, all of its evolution stages, and cards attached to it by flipping a coin correctly. This card became a mainstay in the Pokemon TCG, and up until Sword and Shield, where Scoop Up Net became its replacement, has seen frequent reprints. While Super Scoop Up has always seen some niche play, it was often considered too inconsistent due to its coin flip factor, which is why it has never fully become a staple. That, however, doesn't mean that picking up cards hasn't been. Supporters like AZ that would allow you to pick up one of your Pokemon and discard all cards attached to it have always seen some use to either heal your Pokemon just like Scoop Up did, or to reuse abilities, which gets me to the next part. Something that has slowly creeped its way into the Pokemon TCG is support Pokemon with powerful abilities that can be used once while they're being put into your bench. Cards like Lapras from Legend Maker with its support navigation Pokepower that allows you to search your deck for a supporter card and put it into your hand. Uxie from Legends Awaken with its setup Pokepower that drew cards until the player had 7 cards in hand, and many others in the last to close 20 years have been stable additions to most decks. A lot of these supporter cards were played alongside Super Scoop Up to simply reuse their effect to dig through their deck further. Scoop Up Net gave us a glimpse into what would happen if an item card like Scoop Up was legal today, being an important part of many ability-based decks ever since its release. Without its limitation of not being able to be used on GX and V Pokemon, every single deck would play 4 copies of it, to reuse cards like Genesect V and its Fusion Strike system ability to draw more cards. Pick up cards like Lumineon V and its Luminous Sign ability to search a supporter card and immediately put Lumineon itself back into your hand to prevent your opponent from knocking it out, or so many others that were purposely printed on V cards so that you wouldn't be able to abuse cards like Scoop Up Net. And this doesn't even touch on the fact that you'd be able to pick up some of the 230 HP or more V Pokemon to kill them up. A card that can pick up any Pokemon would simply be way too strong. But we could see them back occasionally with restrictions or coin flips. And at number 3, we have Gust of Wind. This card allows you to simply switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active one. Gust of Wind has been such an iconic part of the history of the Pokemon TCG that any card that allows one player to select an opponent's Pokemon to become active is referred to as a gusting effect. There have been many trainer cards with gusting effects, such as POW, a hand extension, that have had similar effects but only worked if you were behind on prize cards, but had a second optional effect in switching an energy card instead. Throughout the entirety of Diamond and Pearl, Gust effects were completely absent from the game, making it much harder to bypass active Pokemon that you didn't want to deal with. The Heart Gold and Soul Silver era brought two effects similar to Gust of Wind. Pokemon Reversal worked just like Gust of Wind, as long as you were able to call the coin flip correctly. Pokemon Circulator was a guaranteed effect, but your opponent got to choose which Pokemon would be switched in. While these two cards might not seem significantly worse than Gust of Wind, which they were, Pokemon Reversal was a key card in the 2011 World Championship. Almost every deck played 4 copies of it, as correctly called flips could make or break the game depending on which side of the table you were sitting at. In addition to Pokemon Reversal, a card that was previously talked about, Junk Arm, was also played in each deck, allowing for up to 8 coin flips during a game. This deck building philosophy caused many games to be purely decided by which player would be luckier with their coin flips. This, among other reasons, is why many players consider the 2011 World Championship to be one of the worst Pokemon TCG formats in history. While players were already not enjoying having to play Pokemon Reversal in the format, things would get much worse shortly after. In August of 2011, shortly after the notorious 2011 World, a new set was released, Emerging Powers. While bringing a lot of unplayable cards and being considered one of the weakest sets in the entire black and white block, Emerging Powers brought one very significant card back to the TCG. Pokemon Catcher was an almost identical reprint to Gust of Wind, with everything besides the name being the same. As you might have expected based on how influential Pokemon Reversal was at the time, this card became an immediate 4-of of any deck that didn't use an item lock strategy. Item lock strategies, of course, were basically as the name says, strategies that prevented your opponent from using their items, which the format and decks were chock full of. The whole format was warped around Pokemon Catcher, and frustration amongst players was at an all-time high. Many decks became unplayable, and lots of games were decided by whoever found their Pokemon Catchers faster. Eventually, Pokemon realized their mistake and errated Pokemon Catcher to just be like Pokemon Reversal and required a coin flip to be used. This has been the only errata in the entirety of the Pokemon TCG that wasn't based on a mistranslation, but actually changed how a card worked fundamentally. Pokemon Catcher has been reprinted multiple times afterwards, but they've always kept the coin flip. Especially in recent history, most unconditional Gustin effects have been printed on supporter cards instead, as this is probably how it will stay, considering how game-breaking they've been in the past. Gust of Wind will forever be an iconic card and rightfully gets put at 3rd place. Talking about cards that we still have in the game that now require a coin flip, we've got Energy Removal from the base set in 2nd place. Just like Scoop Up in Gust of Wind, this card immediately tells you what's up with its name. Energy Removal lets you discard 1 energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Considering that under normal circumstances, players can only attach 1 energy from their hand to any of their Pokemon, it's not difficult to understand why an effect like this is incredibly powerful. Setting back your opponent an entire turn can give an insane tempo advantage to the player using the removal card. As you might suspect, this card was also played at the full 4 copies per deck during the time, and especially in combination with Item Finder, most games ended up being a war of attrition. If you thought it couldn't get any worse, I've got bad news for you. Super Energy Removal was released at the same time, and made you discard 1 energy from any of your Pokemon to discard up to 2 energies attached to one of your opponents. Comboing these 3 cards meant that decks could include up to 12 energy removal options. Just like some of the other cards in this list that we've seen come back later, Energy Removal also got a coin flip limit put on it. The first printing of Energy Removal 2 came in Expedition and was reprinted multiple times until its last one in Power Keepers. After removal of that kind had been around for almost 10 years, Diamond and Pearl also gave the concept a break, up until a certain set that we've already talked about was released in black and white. Just like Gust of Wind was brought back in Emerging Powers under the name Pokemon Catcher, Energy Removal 2 was brought back as Crushing Hammer. This meant that Pokemon at least realized that regular energy removal was still too powerful without a flip. Crushing Hammer is actually still around today, but has never been a meta-defining card, which doesn't mean it wasn't played at all. As long as it's been around, it's seen play in some decks and still sees play in some slower control-oriented strategies today. Without the coin flip, there's no doubt that every deck would play it at 4 copies, just like back in the base set. And our first place in this list is the most broken item card to ever be released in Professor Oak from the base set. Our 6th base set card on this list, by the way. At the cost of discarding your hand, this card allows you to draw a fresh hand of 7 cards. This also worked if Professor Oak was the last card remaining in your hand, which meant you could play down all your other cards and then draw 7 new ones. For players that have played anywhere between 2010 and 2022, this kind of effect might seem very familiar. Professor Juniper from Black and White, and Professor Sycamore from X and Y, and Professor's Research from Sword and Shield all allow you to discard your hand and then draw 7 new cards. The difference is all of those cards are supporters, which means you could only play one of them during your turn, and would even have to choose between them and other supporters with different effects. This didn't stop any of them from being played, as their effect is incredibly strong even while only being able to use once per turn. If you told any other card game player that there was a card that let you discard your hand and then draw 7 once per turn, they would call for an immediate ban. So now imagine you had access to up to 4 copies of them for a turn. If you were to play all 4 Professor Oaks in your turn, you could draw 28 new cards, which is almost your entire deck. As ridiculous as this might sound, This was easily achievable during its original release. It's hard to put into words how insanely strong an item card that draws 7 new cards is, which is why Professor Oak deserves to first spot on this list, with no other cards even coming close. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other good cards we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, we'd love to hear about them down in the comments.